Hi everyone! Since we had a snow day, just have to make up these lab exercises. All of the lab exercises or activities in exercise 7 will be on the quiz next week. So even though we didn't do it in class, you are still responsible for that material. Now this PowerPoint or video is meant to be a review. You're still expected to do the exercise. This is just trying to mimic what we would do in lab, where you work on the exercise and then we go over it together as a class. So go ahead, get your lab book out. Go ahead and we're going to start on page 112. So last class or last lab, we started doing the testing. So we did an iodine test, and a Buret's test, and a Benedict's test, and a Sudan 4 test to test if a specific solution had glucose in it or had starch or fats or proteins. In last class we did it with controls or with substances we knew had glucose or we knew had fat in it. Now this class, where we're starting on page 112, is foods. So if we are testing milk or testing lettuce or testing tuna, what's in those? Do they have starch? Do they have protein, etc.? So before we even get started, go ahead and fill out the table on page 112. So this is your hypothesis. So what do you think is going to have starch, and what do you think is going to have proteins and lipids and whatnot? Now don't forget that lipids are fats, so just keep that in mind when filling out that table. So you can go ahead and pause now, and then when you're ready to move on, go ahead and click play again. So at this point, you should have already filled out your hypotheses. Now, since we're not in lab, you're not going to be able to actually test these. So I will give you those answers. So if we were in class and you were doing these tests, here's how it would come out. So the way to read this table, this is the same table on page 113, just completed. Here we have lettuce. It tested positive for simple sugars, so recall what test that is. It tested negative for starch, negative for protein, and negative for lipids. Hamburger, we have negative for simple sugars, negative for starch, positive for protein, and positive for lipids. And you can continue doing this and filling that out on your table. Now with this information, with this completed table, you should be able to finish answering the questions that are in activity 2. So what I suggest doing is pausing right as soon as I finish talking, copy down this table, and then start working through the questions. When you've worked through the questions and figured out what you want to put down, go ahead and push play again, and I'll go over those answers. Now don't just go ahead and click play and go ahead and write down what I say, because that's not really going to help you understand the material, and that's what's the most important. So go ahead and pause now. So the first question in the comprehension check, and again, please be sure to try to work through these first before listening to this video. So the first question on page 113 asks, list all the foods that were tested that contained all three of the following: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. So those three foods are actually the last three listed here. So refried beans and peanut butter tested positive for everything. Now, although milk did not contain starch, it does contain glucose. And remember, glucose is a carbohydrate. It is the simplest of carbohydrates. So again, milk is considered this, so your number one answer should be peanut butter, refried beans, and milk. And the second part to that question was relating to think about what those foods are and what their function is in the animal world or in our ecosystems. So why do you think these three foods have really high levels of sugars, proteins, and lipids? whereas these other foods don't. Well, think about milk. Milk is used as a food source. If you think about cow milk, it's used as a food source for baby cows. Well, babies, whether they're cows or people or anything, need lots of nutrients. They're going to grow very quickly. Their brains are developing, all their organs are finishing developing, etc. So they need a lot of things. They need simple sugars, they need starches, they need proteins, they need lipids, they need all of this stuff. Now, if we think about refried beans and peanut butter, specifically the peanuts in peanut butter, you're going to need, or sorry, those are seeds. Beans are seeds. Peanuts are seeds. Yes, they're like nuts and beans, but technically those are a seed of some plant. So peanuts is the seed of a peanut tree. Beans are the seeds of a bean plant. So they're housing baby plants, so to speak. So they are able to, or they need to be able to supply a lot of nutrition to all of their young. Even plants need a lot of nutrition too. No, sorry for that. Okay, so that answers question 1. Question 2 says, this food comes from the leaf of a plant. Leaf cells perform photosynthesis. Which of the 6 food is being described? So that one should be fairly obvious. That'd be lettuce. So lettuce is the leaves of a plant. And if photosynthesis is taking place, I would predict a positive indicator test for simple sugars. Remember, photosynthesis is sun plus water, and I do apologize for the bad writing. I'm using my mouse, plus CO2. And that gives us glucose and oxygen. Oh goodness. Oxygen. So glucose is a simple sugar. At no point in photosynthesis are we talking about protein or lipids. Alright, so I'm flipping to the back page on page 114, and it asks which of the foods tested were positive for lipids. So we just take a look at this right-hand column. It would be all the foods except lettuce. Which of the foods tested use lipids as an energy source for young animals? So this was touched on before. So looking at these 5 foods that have lipids, hamburger and tuna, that's not used as a food source. Refried beans and peanut butter is used as a food source for embryos, but not for plant embryos, but not for young animals. So the answer to this question would be milk. That milk is specifically designed for young animals. Number 5 says muscle tissues is composed of interwoven protein fibers. Using this information, name 2 foods made of muscle tissue that gave you a positive test for protein. So the first thing I'm going to look at is look at this protein column and examine these 5 foods. Well, peanut butter and beans, I just told you, came from plants, so that definitely isn't going to have any muscle fiber. Milk, even though that does come from cows, it's a liquid that's produced. So the answer to this is tuna. So tuna is a fish. When you get the tuna, even out of a tuna can, that's the muscle of a fish. And hamburger. Hamburger is from cows, and that is the meat or the muscle of cows. So there's a lot of protein in mussels. So if you're eating mussels, such as the mussels of hamburger or fish, you would expect it to have lots of protein in it. And finally, the last question on activity 2 is that the hamburger and tuna tested negative for starch, and you can see that here. Explain why foods of this type would not contain starch. So we learned last week's lab that starch is made up of tons of glucose. Well, that glucose comes right here in photosynthesis. Now animals, when you listen to the lecture, you'll see this connection again, but animals cannot make starch. We can get glucose, but we can't package it in a starch like plants can. And you know plants can do that when we did the leaf lab. So cows, tuna, any organism can have glucose. In this case they don't, but they can if they ate it from something else, but they can't turn that into starch. Only plants can turn that into starch. Alright, so that finishes the questions for activity 2. And just as a note to give you tips about the lab quiz, I am not expecting you at all to memorize this table. What was a food positive or negative for? Expect questions that are very similar to the questions that we just went through. So I may tell you that hamburger and tuna tested positive for protein. Well, you should know why, because we're eating mussels. Or you should understand that milk, beans, and peanuts are a food source for developing organisms, whether it's a plant or an animal. Alright, so I am actually going to end this video here. We're at about the 11-minute mark. So go ahead, make sure to double check all of your answers for activity 2. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me. And then go ahead and start taking a look at activity 3 and 4. So the next video is going to go over those two activities.